begin by saying your name?
So I'm Dr. Nina Estrella Luna. I'm a visiting associate professor in the Department of Sociology.
Thank you for being with us. Why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about your research?
So my research generally focuses on the intersection between public policy and social justice. And that can encompass a wide variety of things, from environmental justice to, in the case of the book that we just published, issues related to immigration, as well as issues related to race and gender equity. So in January, we published a book called Promises Made: The Resettlement of Our Allies. What the book is a policy history of the times in which the United States had to evacuate allies in our foreign wars in order to protect them from being targeted by insurgents and extremists and resettle them into the United States. So the book is called Promises Made: The Resettlement of Our Allies, and the book is actually motivated by my co-author's experience as an intelligence officer in Afghanistan in 2008. His life was saved by his own translator when some insurgents essentially were targeting my co-author. And as a result of his translator's actions to save his life, his translator's life became targeted. And so when he came back to the States after that, he decided to do his dissertation work, which I supervised actually, on this whole process of what do we do when we have to evacuate our allies into the United States in order to protect them because they were our allies in our military interventions. So the process really started with his dissertation research, where he did the initial piece of a policy history around the 4 times in which this has happened in the last, since the mid-20th century, and then also an evaluation of the refugee resettlement process itself. So the process really involved reading a lot of documents and chasing down old reports from the 1970s and looking for declassified information on those reports and things like that, as well as interviewing folks going all the way back to the Vietnam War who had experienced this process. Okay.
And then I guess I can just go back and ask
whatever questions you want.
Why?
That's why we have an editor.
So you kind of already answered it. Can we put your second answer in afterwards?
Yeah, no.
I think there was some
what she just said, we put her at the beginning and then we put the rest of the answer.
Okay, yeah, that'll be good. Okay, so then we can just move on. So how does the current emphasis on deportation affect this group of people?
So I'm gonna sort of give a little bit more information, and then I'm going to go into that. Yeah. So in the book, we look at the 4 different conflicts since the mid-20th century where we evacuated foreign allies that worked for the United States on our foreign policy goals, ended up becoming targeted because of that relationship with the U.S. And we resettle them here in the United States. When they come into the United States, they come in as refugees. That's their legal status. And there is a whole program in place to facilitate the integration of refugees. The primary emphasis in that program really is what they call economic self-sufficiency. So getting them working, and it's actually basically defined as not using any kind of social welfare program. And so now, and this has been the policy since the 1970s, the late 1970s, when we started doing this with South Vietnamese allies in the Vietnam War. What has happened in the current administrative process, the current administration, the Trump administration, has an emphasis on deporting anyone who has what's called a deportable offense. Okay? So what ends up happening is, if you're a refugee and you come in, after a year you become a legal permanent resident, a green card holder, But there's a whole series of things that you might become convicted of from a criminal perspective that would make you deportable. For up until very recently, you know, that hasn't really been a huge emphasis from any of the presidents up until the current one. And part of the reason for that is because what makes an offense deportable has changed quite a bit over time. And there are things today that would no longer be a deportable offense that were a deportable offense in the 1980s, and vice versa. And so for a lot of presidents, they just decided, we're not going to deal with that. And then in addition to that, in 1996, the United States signed an agreement with, in 2003, under the Bush administration, we signed an agreement with Vietnam. And this was part of the process of reestablishing relationships with Vietnam, which is a communist country. And in that agreement, we said, we promise not to deport any Vietnamese person who might otherwise be deportable if they arrived in the United States before 1996. And the reason for that is the communist country of Vietnam views those Vietnamese who came before 1996 as disruptive to their country. So even though we could deport them, and because of the deportable offense, they're actually no longer eligible for citizenship or any other regularized status, they were sort of in limbo. And so the agreement was, we won't deport them, all they need to do is check in every once in a while with the Immigration Service. And that's how it's been. You know, it's been that way for the last decade and a half. This current, and by the way, this affects all refugees, not just the special immigrant refugees. What the current administration's emphasis on deportation does is it basically says, even if your country will not take you back, we are going to detain you. We're going to take you out of your community, and we are going to detain you until either they agree to take you back or we don't know. You know. The courts have said this is not exactly acceptable and that kind of thing, but there are still people from the Vietnam War, which is one of the cases that we looked at, as well as from the first Gulf War with the Iraqi Kurds. Now, the people that this affects are people who came over as part of special immigrants at that time period as children. And as children in the 1980s and 1990s, they may have committed offenses like shoplifting, or they got caught up in gangs, and because of that they were convicted or they plead guilty to offenses that made them deportable. Now again, previously those people would never have even been touched, you know, because there was no point in doing that. But the current administration is basically saying, even though you might have committed this offense in 1992, as a 16-year-old child, and you are now, you know, a 30-year-old husband, father, you know, member of your church, member of your community, home-owning person, we're going to rip you out of your community. We're going to detain you until Vietnam or Iraq or Turkey takes you back. And in doing that, actually, we are both disrupting families and communities for really no good reason. These people are not an actual threat to safety and security. We are putting their lives at risk because if they do go back, if they are sent back to those countries, they are very likely to be killed. And they're in that position because their parents, in many cases, were allies to the US in the Gulf War and in the Vietnam War. What we haven't found yet is similar cases for the current wars, for the Afghan and Iraqi special immigrant visa holders, but if this particular trend continues, then of course they are now at significant risk, particularly because there's more deportable offenses than there were in 1985, for example.
Is there anything else you want to say about the book?
Before we talk about the what to do about things, No, I think we can go on because I mean, it's as you read. There's a lot in it.
There's
yeah, yes. The book is chock full of very interesting things.
Okay, so we'll just go to the last question then. So, for anyone who is interested in learning more about this subject or even getting involved, what would you recommend?
Okay. So we recommend you read our book so that you can learn, because the book is a policy history, so you can learn about how this process of bringing in our allies from our wars and integrating them into the country, and what are the circumstances that led to their successful integration, their successful economic stability, socioeconomic stability, and what's happening now that actually makes both integration and economic self-sufficiency more difficult. So the book really does go into the details both in terms of the law and the policy, but also how the programs and how communities actually can be involved in changing the way things are done. In terms of recommendations, one of the things that we have a very long series of recommendations that to both members of Congress, to the refugee settlement agencies at the state level and federal level, the State Department, we have lots of recommendations. But the one that we actually feel has the most legs, right? It doesn't take an act of Congress to make happen, is for members of the National Guard in particular. Because the National Guard are the ones who are actually having the most interaction with a lot of these so-called foreign hires who end up coming here under the special immigrant visa. One of the things that we recommend is that the National Guard develop a process by which when a special immigrant visa holder and their family are resettled in their state, that they become part of the social network of that special immigrant visa holder. One of the challenges in the modern era is the way that they're resettling refugees is it's kind of a random placement across the country. So they're no longer being placed in communities where they are near people who both speak their language and share their culture and share their religious system. And so they come here and they have no social network to help them integrate, to help them find jobs. And so we believe that the National Guard actually would be a really, really good mechanism for creating the community and the family for the special immigrant visa holder and their family. And so, and this is something that, I mean, ideally the National Guards would, create an office and have an actual person, but it could actually be something that, that National Guard members can do really on their own. National Guard members have actually started organizations on their own to support SIV holders and their families overcome some of the barriers to integration that currently exist. We think that the National Guard actually could play a really active role in doing that, and it would actually contribute to both the economic self-sufficiency that our refugee settlement process is based on, and also help the families themselves become more stable.
Is there anything else you want to
I don't think so.
say? Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.